What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a miniseries from much earlier this year, Amazon Prime's The Underground Railroad. I'm overdue to discuss this one as this was out back in May and I saw it back in May, but I just did not get the time to discuss it, especially as I usually get a lot more in depth with TV shows. So before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this show were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button for more movie and some TV related content on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about The Underground Railroad. This stars Thuso Mbedu as Cora, who, after escaping a Georgia plantation, boards a train embarking on a harrowing trip as she seeks true freedom while being hunted by a notorious slave catcher, played by Joel Edgerton. So I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly, but as with my reviews of other TV series that I've covered, this is going to be a brief episode-by-episode breakdown, as that's the best way to discuss TV series as a whole, in my opinion. So if you haven't seen The Underground Railroad yet, and if you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the show, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Based on the 2016 novel of the same name by Colson Whitehead, this is created by Barry Jenkins, who directed all 10 episodes of the series and wrote or co-wrote 4 episodes as well. The original novel is presented as an alternate history. The real Underground Railroad was a network of safe houses and secret routes all throughout the country, whereas the novel presents it all as an actual railroad. Now, I haven't read the novel, though I do know it's received a lot of critical acclaim, and I also know it employs a technique known as magical realism, where it blended elements of fantasy and reality to tell its story. And while I can't attest to how the novel exactly was, this seems to keep in line with Whitehead's original vision, also drawing from both grounded, realistic elements, as well as much more fantastical elements. There were moments throughout our character's journey where there was a sense of hope for them, and those would be heightened to give off this really heavenly feel, brought out by Jenkins' masterful direction. Though on the opposite end of that, there were moments that were absolutely brutal to get through, and the way they were filmed, they legitimately felt like something out of a horror movie, being both terrifying and emotionally gut-wrenching. And Jenkins knew how to really extract genre elements out of the series' most crucial moments without it ever coming across as pulpy or inappropriate, and it allowed him to enhance both the stakes of the situation at hand, as well as each of these characters' emotional journeys. It was mesmerizing stuff, and I will say up front that in terms of sheer technique, this might just be some of his finest work to date. Now, each episode was broken up into chapters, most of which took place in a different state, typically ending with Cora moving on to the next state by the end of each episode, at least through the first half of the series, and a couple of others. At first, it almost seemed like there was this very episodic nature to it. However, it's one that actually had a lot of really well-crafted character arcs, usually always having a reason for moving around the way it did, and it would actually be quite subversive when handling certain character and storytelling tropes. Now, one thing I'll say is, before diving into the episodes themselves, is that this is a series that I think would be better off not being binged. Despite being released all at once on Amazon Prime and having watched a few episodes myself in one sitting, I do think this is better to watch not all crammed together. It's a show with a lot going on, but it's one that's also methodical in nature and requires you to sit with it a little after watching. So the more viewing sessions needed to get through this, the better in my opinion. So the first episode, titled Georgia, sets the stage, mainly taking place on this plantation where Cora is initially kept, though the wheels are quickly set into motion where she plans her escape along with a fellow slave named Caesar, played by Aaron Pierre, after they witness the public death of another slave. While sequences such as those are absolutely gut-wrenching, Jenkins often handles a lot of the other material as gracefully as he can, with beautiful music and cinematography accompanying some of the characters' shots, as well as containing a repeated motif of hearing what sounds like a lot of crickets chirping really loudly, often used to convey the claustrophobia felt by Cora as well as some of the other characters, and he tries to offer you a little bit into their thought process without having them say too much at times. The main dynamic of the series is set here, as Cora and Caesar are initially caught by a group of trackers, one of whom Cora hits in the head, causing her to be wanted for attempted murder. And that's where Joel Edgerton as a slave catcher named Ridgway comes into play as the primary antagonist, and he's accompanied by a young black aide named Homer, played by Chase W. Dillon. And for the majority of this series, it's essentially 2 parallel stories, with Cora on the run, with Ridgway and Homer after her, with them crossing paths quite a number of times. Though the first instance in the series where I was caught totally off guard was that I was expecting Caesar to be another primary focus of the series as well, and it would be the 2 of them running from Ridgway. Though to my surprise, that wasn't the case, as he was is cornered by Ridgway in the second episode, South Carolina, which causes Cora to have to flee on her own. Now, the second and third episodes, with the latter being titled North Carolina, explore some of the communities that Cora encounters in her escape, and these two are probably the most where the horror-like elements really come into play. In the South Carolina episode, we see a town that initially seems friendly, with everyone seemingly helping Cora and Caesar, only to discover that everyone's actually trying to control all facets of Black people's lives, with the doctor Cora visits especially trying to coerce her into sterilization. Meanwhile, in the third episode, Cora, along with another runaway girl named Grace, takes refuge with a couple named the Martins, played by Damon Herriman and Lily Rabe. Though we discover the town they're in has formed some sort of cult that will turn into an angry mob almost at a moment's notice, as they look to eliminate anyone who's not like them. While the people in the second episode seem friendly on the surface, the townspeople in the third episode don't hide who they really are, and it is eerie, especially whenever seeing them truly all in sync with one another. It's enough to send chills up your spine, though Jenkins' handling of genre elements, while still conveying the reality of what our characters have to endure, is nothing short of masterful here. And this episode was easily one of the finest examples that showcased Thuso Mbedu's skills as an actress. She was just phenomenal here in what's her international debut in front of the camera, and it's actually quite a shame that she did not get nominated for an Emmy for this role. Her performance is so brilliantly subtle, with more scenes than I can count relying on her facial expressions, whether it's exploring things like the trauma she endures, or her determination to push through her journey, even when the odds are clearly stacked against her. Now, while there are a number of fantastic scenes all throughout this where we explore the relationship she has with other characters, even minor characters like the Martins in episode 3, and she does a fine job of playing off the rest of the cast, she's at her absolute best during these more introspective sequences. In fact, I'd say introspective would be the best way that I describe this series as a whole. Like I said, it's one that never felt exploitative when handling its horrific subject matter. While it can certainly be uncomfortable to get through at so many points, to say the least, that's also not its overall purpose. Instead, what we get is this deeply meditative character study centered on Cora. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it's a story that surprisingly even offers a little bit of hope at times, mainly through the sequences where we see the actual Underground Railroad. We usually see it at the end of an episode, especially these first few, and there would be this heavenly quality as it's seen coming to the rescue, going back to that magical realism aesthetic. And the way Jenkins would frame each of these sequences made for some top-notch work. Now, episode 3 unfortunately ends on one of the most horrifying notes, with Ridgway catching up to Cora and a mob forming, burning the Martins' house down, and with Grace's fate being unknown. And it was probably one of the series' most emotional high points, which is saying something since we're only a third of the way through by this point. However, episode 4, titled The Great Spirit, takes us back to Ridgway's youth, where we explore his relationship with his father, Ridgway Sr., who's the total opposite of him, as a man who absolutely detests slavery. And we see how the two of them don't get along whatsoever, and we also see at one point, in one of the series' most jaw-dropping moments, he convinces a boy named Mac to jump down a well, which causes a permanent limp due to his envy of his father's workers. Now, this whole episode is one big flashback, and it was solid, if not quite one of the better entries in the series. I mean, it's always solid when we get more fleshed out villains, and it's great Jenkins was able to flesh out Ridgway without humanizing him, considering how much of a monster he is, but this episode basically just reinforced what we already knew right from the start, which is that Ridgway is a horrible person. And the thing is, the series isn't Ridgway's story, so I didn't think an hour dedicated to his backstory was totally necessary in my view. Like, I'm glad we get more than just like a scene or a line's worth exploring him, and we do come back to some of this stuff in the present day sequences, so I get it, but I don't think an hour-long episode was exactly needed. Later on in the series, we do get to a very short 20-minute episode, which I'll get to in a bit, and now knowing that, I think this episode could have benefited from also being about 20 minutes or so, as I think that's all that was really needed to get its point across, though that might just be a personal preference. Episode 5, which is one of 2 Tennessee-centered episodes, this one titled Exodus, goes back to the present day, with Cora, also with another enslaved man named Jasper, on her way back to Georgia with Ridgway and Homer. Now, this was another great episode that really allowed Mbedu to shine performance-wise, especially in her interactions with Edgerton throughout the episode. This also briefly explores how Ridgway and Homer met, with the latter never leaving his side after being immediately set free by him. And this was a great insight into this character, who always remains loyal to Ridgway without question. The episode ends with Jasper dying, while Cora attempts to escape, with Ridgway catching up to her, and it leads into episode 6, which is the second Tennessee-centered episode titled Proverbs, where we go back to exploring Ridgway Ridgway's relationship with his father, now set in the present-day sequences. He and Cora make their way to his father's home as he's dying, and Ridgway, despite their strained relationship, looks to pay his respects. Now, I will say again, I think especially after finding out we do revisit this storyline here, I think an hour-long exploration in that 4th episode was not totally necessary. This was much better in my view, as it continued to explore that relationship while still keeping the episode's focus primarily on Cora. But what I will say is, while this isn't Ridgway's story, Joel Edgerton does a really great job here. While he has played his fair share of compelling protagonists before, whenever he gets to play someone a lot more sinister, he's really on top of his game, and that's the case here, with probably his most evil role to date. He usually plays more scene-chewing characters when playing someone unlikable, but here this is a much more subdued type of sinister. And it's a character who you just immediately hate right from the start, and despite getting more insights into his childhood and his relationships with his father, and just the way he thinks in general, your hatred for him just goes up as the series goes on, and I thought Edgerton brought that out really well. This episode was probably his most solid performance-wise, as we see him reunite with his father, with no reconciliation between the two. Plus, we also see Mac from episode 4, now grown up and still limping. This was a really solid character-driven episode, though it ended in an explosive way, with Cora being freed by a group of freedmen led by William Jackson Harper as their leader named Royal, and after that, Ridgway's chained to his bed, causing Homer to shoot Mac and free Ridgway. We then get to episode 7, which is the series' shortest episode, clocking in at about 20 minutes. It cuts back to the end of episode 3, where the Martins' house is burned down by the angry mob. We find out that Grace, the young girl who was with Cora in that episode and was presumed to have been trapped as the house was burning, making it out and into the Underground Railroad, where she reveals to the train manager that her real name is Fanny Briggs, who the episode's named after. But she's a character who I found out isn't part of the original book. It's supposedly a reference to the novel's author, Colson Whitehead's debut work, The Intuitionist, which I also haven't read, though there's not much to say regarding this, other than to provide some closure to this character. But we don't see her reappear at any point, which I was hoping would have been the case. So we never get to see her reunite with Cora, but either way, it's one of the few truly hopeful moments in the series, considering we thought she was gone. So I'm glad Jenkins went back and revisited this particular character, but considering this episode's length, there's really not much else to say about it. We then go back to Cora in episode 8, titled Indiana Autumn, where she stays with Royal at a black community on a farm, and for a brief moment, we take a breath, as this is the first real instance where Cora feels safe. It's not too often we get a moment like this in this series. While I just got through saying episode 7 was one that ended on a more positive note, letting us know a character we thought died was still alive, in general this was rarely a show that got a chance to just take a moment, and understandably so, given the events that unfold. But William Jackson Harper is always a pleasant sight to see, exuding his usual likable charm, and giving another of my favorite performances here. While his role in the series may be small, only being in a few episodes, it's actually huge for Cora's growth, as he tries helping her let go of her past and look at the bigger picture. This leads her to telling her story to the community in the 9th episode, Indiana Winter. Though that feeling of warmth for her is unfortunately short-lived, as Ridgway is once again on the move, with much of the episode showing him desperately trying to get a warrant to search the community and find Cora. And this probably shows Ridgway at his most pathetic, as he's constantly denied access to the community, but he just doesn't let it go, getting to the point where he stops the judge on the street and pleads with him publicly. He eventually gets his way, though it's by him and Homer sneaking in, resulting unfortunately in Royal's death among many others, and him catching Cora once again. But unlike most other episodes resulting in Cora's capture, this time the tables are turned, and Cora manages to trick and shoot Ridgway, killing him, before escaping with a young girl named Molly. And it was such an emotionally satisfying moment, not only because Cora finally managed to stop Ridgway, but because her arc essentially comes full circle here. She seems stronger than ever here, despite all the trauma she's endured, and the times it seemed like she was ready to give up. You can tell this isn't the same person as she was at the start of the series, and the way this managed to perfectly balance an engaging story with such rich character development is nothing short of brilliant. Though we only get to see so much of Cora after this moment, as the final episode, titled Mabel, takes a turn that I wasn't quite expecting. In the very first episode, it's mentioned Cora's mother Mabel had escaped Ridgway, and disappeared without a trace, with this being the only time someone has eluded him completely. This episode reveals exactly what happened, with much of it being one giant flashback to Mabel, played by Sheila Atim. After taking some time to get us introduced to the character, we see Mabel had initially fled, only to realize she left a young Cora behind, causing her to go back, only to be bitten by a snake and dying without anyone seeing it or knowing that it happened. Now, having the final episode mostly circle back to this, admittedly did throw me off a bit. While it was good the series revisited this, truthfully, considering the mystery of Cora's mother wasn't exactly the primary focus of the series, I did find it jarring just a bit, especially considering we just had this huge emotional moment at the end of the 9th episode, and we really don't get to see much of our main characters in the present beyond this. But Sheila Atim was solid here, and I thought this episode was really well done, which was the case with just about every episode, to be honest. That was always the great thing about it. Even during moments where it may not have been quite as strong, it still looked really great, and it was always engaging on some level. Though to be clear, this episode, along with the show itself, does end on a solid note. We eventually do cut back to Cora and Molly in the present day for the final 15 minutes. We see them escaping the Underground Railroad and eventually get a ride from a stranger, where they set off on their next journey. But we see from the look on Cora's face, from just how tired she is, that even though this chapter in her life is now over, she has a long way to go. And that concludes the series, and it's another brilliant piece of work from Barry Jenkins. It's haunting, emotionally resonant, and beautifully filmed. From a technical level, it's some of the finest production values I've seen in either a film or TV series all year, to be honest. Everything from the cinematography, the score, the sound mixing were all wonderful. Like, it's fitting that this got a theatrical, though very, very limited, re-release, as it feels truly cinematic. More so than a number of movies I've seen this year. And all the performances, as I've said, were top-notch, from Thuso Mbedu to Joel Edgerton to supporting roles like William Jackson Harper and Sheila Atim, with Chase Dillon and Aaron Pierre also being big standouts as Homer and Caesar respectively. Though as I've also said throughout this, it's not an easy watch, given its subject matter and all the unsettling moments. It's one that I get you might not want to watch due to how horrifying it can be, though what I will say is, this isn't a series that looks to just exploit trauma. And if you already saw this or still want to see it, you'll notice Jenkins handles the material with as much care as he can, though while still making the harsh realities of the time painfully clear. But this is also a character study, and one that feels poetic at times, with themes like being able to persevere through trauma and trying to hold on to that sense of hope even in the worst of times. We see this with the more fantastical portrayal of the Underground Railroad itself, or whenever we see Cora trying to push through, and it was all really well done, without Jenkins resorting to being schmaltzy or anything. Now, regarding my criticisms, I don't have too many, but the main thing is basically pacing. As I've said, this is a methodical and introspective show. It's not one that moves particularly fast for the most part, so there were times maybe things would feel a bit sluggish, whether it be it lingered on a shot for too long, or it stayed on a particular subplot too much. And as I said, it all looks great and it's engaging on some level from a technical viewpoint, but from a storytelling angle, there were a couple of things that didn't quite work for me, at least in terms of where certain story elements are placed. As I said, I do think things like not spending an entire episode focused on Ridgway's past would have been nice, as I didn't think that was necessary, and I found things like having the last episode mostly be a flashback to be a bit jarring. But I think a lot of it's going to come down to personal preference, to be quite honest. Some of these things might not bother you as much. Either way though, that doesn't take away from just how powerful the series can be, and at the end of the day, it's still very effective. The Underground Railroad is truly one of the finest series to be released this year. It's by no means one that's easy to get through, but if you are able to sit down with it, it's a very rewarding experience. Between its timely themes, its stunning direction by Barry Jenkins, its top-notch production values, and fantastic performances from a truly talented cast, this is breathtaking and one of the most cinematic TV series I've seen in quite some time. The Underground Railroad gets an 8 out of 10. So let me know, did you see the Underground Railroad, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Was this one of your favorite Barry Jenkins projects? Do you have a favorite Amazon Prime series? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film and TV.